The frontier town of Silver Peak was hosting its annual market day in the summer of 1889, when livestock goods and, in the unsavory underbelly of commerce, people were bought and sold. Among the items being auctioned that day were 3 young women, all of whom had been orphaned or abandoned by their families. The auctioneer, a man named Corbett with a voice like gravel and a heart like stone, presented them with the enthusiasm of a man selling cattle. "First lot," he called out, gesturing toward a pretty blonde girl with bright eyes. Sarah Mitchell, 16 years old, healthy and strong. Excellent for domestic work or matrimony. Who'll start the bidding at $200. Hand shot up immediately. The bidding climbed to $800 before a wealthy rancher claimed her, presumably as a wife or household servant. "Second lot," Corbett announced. Mary Hutchins, 14, orphaned, able-bodied. "Who'll bid?" Again, hands rose, and Mary was sold to a merchant who needed cheap labor for his store. "Third lot," Corbett said, his tone shifting to something vaguely apologetic. "We have Eleanor Blackwell, 18 years old. Now, I should tell you straight. She's mute. Can't speak a word. Born that way, I'm told. Can't hear neither, or so they say. She's a hard sell, I know, but she's strong. Good with her hands. Who'll give me $50? The crowd fell silent. $50 was an insulting price, less than a tenth of what the other girls had fetched. But it was a reaction to bidders that was more telling. A few dismissive shakes of heads, quiet comments to neighbors, the general sense that a mute, deaf girl was less than worthless. $50? Corbett repeated, a hint of desperation creeping into his voice. "Come on. Surely someone can use cheap labor? She won't complain about wages if you don't pay 'em. Won't beg for time off. Won't cause trouble. $25? Anyone." A single hand rose. It belonged to a man in his mid-40s, weathered and quiet, with dark eyes that held something different from the calculation evident in every other man present. His name was William Merrick, and he was a wealthy rancher known for his integrity and his unusual compassion toward those society deemed disposable. $50, he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "And I'm prepared to pay in gold right now, if you have paperwork to transfer ownership." The deal was done quickly. Eleanor Blackwell was released from her holding pen and handed over to William like a piece of livestock. She was skeletal, clearly malnourished, and her eyes held a kind of resignation that suggested she had already surrendered to whatever fate awaited her. William purchased basic supplies in town, blankets, clothing, food, and then took Eleanor to his ranch, a sprawling operation about 40 miles south of Silver Peak. As they rode, Eleanor sat rigidly beside him on the horse, her body tense with fear, her eyes darting constantly as if expecting violence at any moment. When they arrived at the ranch, William helped Eleanor down from the horse with gentle hands. He led her to the main house and showed her to a clean, comfortable room, not a servant's quarters, but a proper guest bedroom with a window that looked out over the grasslands. "You're safe here," William said, speaking slowly and clearly, though he knew she couldn't hear him. He demonstrated by touching his chest and speaking the word William. Then he pointed to her and raised his eyebrows in question. Eleanor pointed to herself and tried to form words with her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked down, as if ashamed of this fundamental inability to communicate. William smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, and nodded. He pointed around the room and then to her, trying to communicate that this space was hers. He brought her food and watched to ensure she ate. He provided her with clean water for bathing, and he made no demands of her beyond rest and recovery from whatever ordeal had left her so physically damaged. Over the following weeks, Eleanor began to understand that the man who had bought her had no intention of exploiting her. He didn't touch her inappropriately. He didn't demand labor beyond her strength. He didn't treat her as property to be used. Instead, he began a process of communication that would slowly transform both their lives. William realized that Eleanor could read and write. She had been educated before whatever tragedy had struck her deaf and mute. He began leaving notes for her, simple messages about what he was doing, what was happening at the ranch, and questions about her preferences and her well-being. Eleanor, shocked by this basic human respect, began responding in writing. Slowly, in careful script, she began to communicate. Yes, she preferred the Western room, because of the view. Yes, she was hungry. No, she didn't want to eat venison. She had an aversion to it. She was sorry for being so much trouble. William's responses were always the same. She was no trouble. She was valued. Her preferences mattered. As Eleanor recovered physically, she began to venture outside. William showed her the ranch, explaining things through written notes and through gestures. He brought her to the stables and introduced her to the horses, watching as Eleanor's expression transformed when she encountered a gentle mare. Without speaking or hearing, Eleanor connected with the animal in a way that transcended language. William brought Eleanor riding clothes and taught her to ride. At first, she was terrified, uncertain if she could trust a man, uncertain if her body could handle the physical demands. But slowly, week by week, Eleanor discovered that she could ride. She could control a horse through subtle shifts of weight and posture. She could find freedom in the open prairie. One afternoon, as they rode together across grassland that seemed to stretch endlessly, Eleanor turned to William and pointed herself, then made writing motions. When they stopped, she pulled out a small notebook she begun carrying and wrote in careful script. "Why did you buy me? I'm worthless. Everyone says so." William read the words carefully, and his expression grew serious. He took the notebook and wrote back, "You are not worthless. You are valuable because you exist. Your silence doesn't diminish your worth. Your deafness doesn't diminish your worth. Your willingness to survive despite everything. That demonstrates tremendous strength." He paused and added, "I bought you because I saw what others missed. I saw a woman who deserved to be treated with dignity. That's all." Over the following months, Eleanor's transformation was remarkable. Her body filled out as proper nutrition replaced starvation. Her eyes, once hollow with despair, began to hold something new, hope. She learned the rhythms of ranch life. She began working the kitchen, preparing meals with an artistry that surprised everyone. She communicated with the other workers through a combination of writing, gestures, and a kind of sign language she and William began to develop together. And something deeper was happening between William and Eleanor, something neither of them could name or articulate, but both felt with increasing clarity. Eleanor began spending her free time in the library, reading everything she could find. She read novels and poetry and history. She read about the world beyond the ranch, hungry for knowledge and understanding. William, watching her read by lamplight, would feel something shift in his chest, a recognition of her intelligence, her curiosity, her fundamental humanity that society had deemed unworthy of value. One evening, as Eleanor sat reading, William left her a note. "Eleanor, I need to tell you something, and I'm using writing because it's the only way I can be certain you understand my meaning clearly. Over the past months, watching you recover and grow stronger and more yourself, I have come to love you, not out of pity or responsibility, but because you are remarkable. I don't expect anything in return. I simply need you to know that you have value beyond measure." Eleanor read the note 3 times, tears streaming down her face. She took the pen with trembling hands and wrote, "I thought I was broken. I thought no one would ever see me as anything but broken. You gave me back myself. How could I not love you?" Their marriage took place 6 months later in a quiet ceremony at the ranch, witnessed by the community members who had come to respect Eleanor for her work ethic and her gentle spirit. William made their vows by speaking them aloud, and then writing them so Eleanor could read them. Eleanor made her vows by writing them carefully, in clear script that left no ambiguity about her commitment and her love. What emerged was something beautiful and unprecedented for the time, a marriage based entirely on mutual respect, on intentional communication, on a willingness to bridge the gap that society said should separate them. Eleanor became known throughout the territory not as the mute girl, not as the deaf woman, not as the woman society had rejected. She became known as Eleanor Merrick, the rancher's wife who managed a household with brilliant efficiency, who had transformed the kitchen into something approaching artistry, who communicated with everyone around her in ways that transcended words. Most importantly, She became known as a woman who had been deemed worthless by society, and then claimed as the greatest treasure by a man who saw past society's judgment to the truth of her worth. Years later, when people asked Eleanor about being sold at auction, about the moment William had bought her for $50, she would reflect on what that price had really meant. Not her true value, that was incalculable, but rather society's blindness. Society's willingness to dismiss anything that didn't fit neatly into predetermined categories of value. "I was never worthless," Eleanor would write in her careful script, communicating with visitors who came to the ranch. "I was only considered worthless by people who measured value in the wrong ways. William taught me that worth isn't determined by what you can say or what you can hear. It's determined by who you are, by your capacity for kindness, by your willingness to survive and build something meaningful despite everything working against you." She would pause, and a smile would cross her face. "He didn't buy me for $50 because I was cheap," she would continue. "He bought me for $50 because everyone else was too blind to see what I really was. And in rescuing me from that auction block, he rescued himself from a lonely life. We rescued each other, really. That's what real love is. Two broken things recognizing that together they can be whole." William and Eleanor lived for another 40 years together. They never had biological children, but they took in several young people society had deemed disposable, giving them the same gift William had given Eleanor: the belief that their worth was not determined by society's judgment, but by their own inherent value as human beings. When William died at 85, Eleanor continued to work alone for another decade. She established a school for deaf and mute children, revolutionary for its time, believing that these children had the same capacity for learning and growth as any other child. She became a voice, quite literally, through her writings, through the sign language she had developed, for those society had rendered voiceless. And on her grave, simple words were inscribed: "Eleanor Merrick, bought for $50, worth infinitely more than that, not because a man chose her, but because she chose to be worthy despite the world telling her she wasn't." It was a testament not just to her resilience, but to the transformative power of being truly seen, truly valued, and truly treasured by someone who understood that society's judgment was not the final word on anyone's worth.